From Toronto to Tokyo, and from Thonia to Syrinx, this is The Basement, your companion to the Ready Player One novel. Join our hosts each episode for complete chapter breakdowns and deep dives into the pop culture references through a series of challenges and homework assignments. The Basement is the Ready Player One podcast for people who love things. And now, please welcome Albert and the rest of the Gunchers for this week's episode. Hello, Gunchers, and welcome to the Basement Podcast. This is Albert Padilla, and this is the final episode of Chapter 6, and I mean it this time. This really is the final episode of Chapter 6. We're back. We're going to put a big, nice, table-sized bow on top of this chapter, and to help me do so, I'm going to welcome a brand new Guncher to the show. He's a personal friend of mine. He's a fellow Gen Xer and someone who brings a very unique perspective on the gaming industry. Please welcome Gunter and Mr. Snack Hack, Neal Robison. Neal, welcome to the Basement, sir, and thank you for the Dreamcast.
Hey, no problem. I won't take full credit for that, but glad I added several hours to your entertainment as a young man.
Yeah, more than several hours, as a matter of fact. So before we get into your experience with the novel, I teased just now that you have this unique perspective on the gaming industry, and I just wanted to see if you could just give our listeners a little bit about your background there, and then maybe share some background about what you're doing today with the Mr. Snack Hack Instagram TV and YouTube channel that you've got going on.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I've spent about 30 years in the video game business, and I've been really lucky because I've seen the business from so many different sides, from being, a developer, being a publisher, or being at a publisher, being at a platform holder, which would be Sega, and being involved in consoles and PC games and handheld and Game Boys and PSPs and just about every platform that you can imagine. I've been lucky enough to be associated with it. And the latest things that I have been working on with mostly PC games as well as some mobile games and VR and augmented reality. So it's been great. Yeah. Just a real lucky guy to be able to do that and get paid to do it. In terms of Mr. Snack Hack, this is a fun thing that I do on the side. I actually review snacks online, you name it, and I'm basically testing it out. Some of the companies enjoy what I do online and have sent me snacks to review, which is really the best of both worlds, right?
Right.
Not only do I get to try the latest flavors of M&Ms, but somebody's sending them to me at times. So it's pretty good. So having fun.
Good deal. So cereal is a big thing, right? If you've listened to this show with any regularity, we know we talk about cereal quite a bit. In fact, on our Discord server, we have an entire channel that's just dedicated to cereal debates. And you recently did one on the Pop-Tart cereal, which I was not aware that they were doing Pop-Tart cereal, but you've done two now, right? You did like the cinnamon brown sugar and was it the strawberry?
Yeah, it was the strawberry. Yeah. Absolutely some of the strangest cereals you'll ever meet because it's taking a Pop-Tart and turning it into cereal, which doesn't make any sense at all, right? But it was fantastic. And if you're a fan of Pop-Tarts, I mean, you can't not like that. So it turned out pretty good. The weird one was the Sour Patch Kids cereal. But,
I saw that.
We could go on and on about cereals. Trust me. I may have to jump onto that Discord server.
Yeah. Well, the biggest controversy that we have there is whether, which is greater, Fruity Pebbles or Captain Crunch. And I'd rather eat shards of glass than Captain Crunch personally. So it's about the same thing.
Same thing, apparently. Yeah.
Let's talk about the Dreamcast because I tease that as well. But this is I don't know if as I was prepping for this show, we're coming up on the 20th. And is it 20 years now?
Yeah, it's 20 years this September, and in fact, a lot of the Sega employees that were around when we launched it on 9/9/99 are talking about getting together for a 20th reunion. We've got some of the other execs that were there along with myself, and we're thinking about getting together and really reliving some of those amazing, crazy days.
That is awesome. I was hoping you would say that. Honestly, we hadn't spoken about that, but I thought, what a great idea to get everybody together 20 years later and just kind of celebrate the success of the Dreamcast. And on that note, more recently, you had a chance to reconnect with one of your old mates from the Dreamcast. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I have you to thank for that, Albert. Actually, so at the time that I worked at Sega, there were several CEOs and presidents certainly over that time, but one that really stood out was Peter Moore. He was a guy that came from the shoe industry and was really into sports and brought a really great marketing perspective. And he headed up Sega for right around the launch, right after it. And so he actually went on to work at EA, heading up their sports, and worked at Microsoft. And he ended up moving back to England, and he now is head of the Liverpool Football Club. And
I may have heard of them.
Yeah, just incredible presence around the world, and he's the perfect guy for it. So he came and actually spoke at a pub, an official Liverpool fan pub here in Austin. And you alerted me to it because I had no idea he was in town. So I jumped in the car, went over there, and we had a great reunion. He's a terrific guy, and it was good to catch up with him.
That's awesome. No, I'm so glad. And I had actually, honestly, I was aware that he was coming because anytime they bring anybody from the club, whether it's someone that's currently involved in the club or a former player, that kind of thing, we book those things so far in advance. And it completely slipped my mind to let you know. And then I saw I think it was that day, somebody had posted a picture saying, hey, don't forget tonight, Peter Moore is going to be out here over at, was it BD Riley's, I think. Yeah. And so, yeah, I'd messaged you and you were like, oh, I think you messaged back saying, I'm gone. I'm in the car now. I'm heading out or whatever.
It was starting like in, a half hour. And I'm like, it's too great an opportunity. That poor guy travels around the world, but he doesn't come to Austin that often. So he was here awesome. For South by Southwest, and it just added up to a magical moment.
Great. Good deal. All right. Well, let's, before we get into the main show, I got one last thing that I want to just kind of poke your brain on here. Mm-hmm. And that's really about the novel. So we do a segment here that anytime someone's new to the show, we kind of want to get a feel for what your level of interest is with Ready Player One. Either it be the novel, it can be the movie, it can be any of the pop culture references, that sort of thing. But where are you in your fandom with Ready Player One?
I'm really high on the whole thing. I mean, literally everything connected to it. I think Klein's a genius, and not just because he wrote a great book that, read really well, but literally that guy did his homework and just hit on every touch point of my growing up. And I'm a huge fan of pop culture. And he was able to weave it in without just being a bunch of laundry lists, right? That it actually made sense given the context. And I just fell in love with it. I had a friend who found the book, back in, I think it was like late 2011, and turned me on to it and actually went out and bought me a copy in early 2012 because this good friend of mine said, this is your book. And literally, I can't go another day without you reading this because you're going to love it. And he was absolutely right. So it was a love affair early on. And I've just appreciated everything. And then, I mean, there's lots of stuff we'll talk about, but I love the movie as well. I know, some people aren't big fans. It doesn't matter to me, but just seeing it come to life is it's absolutely fantastic. And I think Spielberg did a good job given the material that he had to work with and trying to please a very broad audience. Right. I think it was great.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of that, and just to kind of tack on, just the amount of IPs that they had to pull together.
It's ridiculous,
right? In order to kind of pull that off, and we didn't get everything, one for one from the book, and there's definitely some understanding in terms of why we couldn't get that stuff. But for the most part, we got stuff that we didn't get in the book that I was just as happy to see. Right, brought to life on.
The Shining.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh, what a great surprise though for people that were huge fans. Like, that was a nice twist that I didn't know everything that was going to happen.
Well, cool. So it sounds like you're in good hands, or we're in good hands, I guess, going into this episode with this last part of this chapter. So before we go any further, I do want to give a huge shout out to all the co-hosts that assisted with Chapter 6. So thank you guys and girl for the time, the dedication, the effort, and all the show prep that you guys did. They were so much fun to do, and the feedback from our supporters and the reviews that we're seeing on iTunes has been overwhelming and really humbling. So thank you all for everything that you guys did to get the show to where it's at today.
Absolutely.
All right. So what's left in Chapter 6? Well, once Wade wraps up just how much he knows and recalls from Anorak's Almanac, he mentions that even with all the other pop culture knowledge from movies, TVs, cartoons, video games, it turns out that he gets the next clue from being at school, and he's talking about tabletop role-playing games. And it all started with some lettering that's in Anorak's Almanac, which originally Wade thought were imperfections in the printing. And instead, it turns out to be a secret code. So there was 112 letters in the Almanac and that had this kind of imperfection. And once he kind of spelled them all out or laid them out on a piece of paper, it gave us the limerick. And so the limerick reads, the copper key awaits explorers in a tomb filled with horrors, but you have much to learn if you hope to earn a place among the high scores. So I want to pause here and just kind of talk about the release of Ready Player One, the novel. You mentioned in 2012, just months after the release of the novel, Klein actually announced that within the novel itself, there was an elaborate Easter egg, very similar to what was in the one in the novel that Anorak had put out there, Halliday had put out there, and that the winner of this contest would win a DeLorean, like your own brand new shiny DeLorean, if you could figure this out. So as of somebody who read that novel back then, and this is kind of right in that time frame, were you aware that this game was in the actual novel when it was released around that time?
Not at all. I mean, I literally, kicked myself afterwards, but it was amazing. And it just, it brought me back to the genius of Klein, that not only did he write this book and had all of these things going on, but he spent the time to really put that Easter egg in there as an homage, right, to the character.
Right.
And the resources that he marshaled for this hidden Easter egg series is incredible. I mean, it's incredible. I've never heard of another publication doing that before that time.
Yeah. And so there was a couple of things that you had to do in order to, so there was basically, I think, 3 steps, if I'm not mistaken,
yes.
Right? And the first step was you had to find, you got into a game that had been created by some let me back up. You first had to decipher this URL, right? Once you deciphered the URL, it would take you to anoraksalmanac.com. I think that's still out there. I'm going to click this right now because I haven't had a chance to click it recently. But
it absolutely is live. I just checked it the other day.
Okay, so anoraksalmanac.com. You guys can head out to that if you're not aware of this and you want to just play along and see what's there. But once you got there, there was kind of like this gate that you had to get through. And in order to get through this gate, you had to play an original Atari 2600 game called The Stacks. And The Stacks was actually developed by Mika and Kevin Wilson. So I want to come back to Mika and Kevin Wilson in a second. But once you got through that first game, the second stage of the contest then required you to play another game called Ultimate Collector Garage Sale, which was developed by Portalarium Games, which is based here in the mighty Austin, Texas. Mm-hmm. And it's programmed by Lord British himself.
Yep, Richard Garriott.
So again, and this isn't the first time he's mentioned him, and I think both Klein and Garriott are close friends now, if they weren't prior to this. But I mean, how cool would it be to just call up Mika and Kevin Wilson and Lord British and say, "Hey, bud, I need some games. Can you mind do me a solid one here and give me some stuff to work with?"
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, from what I understand and looking at some interviews back at that time, I don't think he was buds with Richard Garriott. I think he approached him with this idea and had to sell him on the whole thing. Yeah, and it was genius and pretty ballsy for that guy to reach out to at least Garriott. I'm not aware of whether he had a standing relationship with Mike or Kevin. But yeah, this is amazing that he would go to these lengths because he was basically making something that he would want to do. Right. And so we're all, fans like he is of all of these things. And the fact that it was Atari 2600 kicking it off, genius, right? How many people code Atari 2600 games anymore? It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So once you got to that, all right, so that's the second stage. And then the final stage, and arguably the most difficult stage, was the very last one, because you had to set a world record for the Atari 2600 versions of either Pac-Man, Joust Arcade, Joust Atari 2600, Black Tiger, or Roboton 2084. No big deal, right? All you had to do is make the world record. If you got through all three of those, then you would be eligible to kind of win. And so the winner of this was a gentleman by the name of Craig Queen, who he set the world record in Joust Atari 2600 just 8 days after that last challenge was announced. So he jumped right on top of it, broke the world record, and won the DeLorean.
And Klein actually was prepared for this to last a long time because, I mean, this is no small feat. Right. In fact, he was going to add additional arcade games to the list so that it would broaden the number of choices and kind of enlarge the pool a little bit. And before you even got a chance to even think about that, boom, Craig just ended up winning it. The best part was when they awarded it to him, they did it on a TV show called X-Play. And this was back
G4.
Yeah, exactly. It was Tech TV first, and then it was G4. Yeah. And they used to film in the same building as Sega, and we would go down and hang out with those guys all the time.
Nice.
Yeah, it was really cool. Adam's just an amazing guy, and so is Morgan.
I miss Adam and Morgan.
Yeah, no kidding, right?
I don't follow them anymore. I wonder what they're up to these days.
I have no idea. But it was really fun. He actually gave Craig the DeLorean right there on the show, and it was perfect way to do it.
So here's what you may not know about this whole contest after it completed. And so I was fortunate to attend the premiere of I attended the Atari Game Over. They did a premiere. They did a viewing here in Austin about almost a year and a half ago, over down at the Ritz downtown. And at one point, while Ernie and Zach Penn were there, Ernie started kind of retelling the story about what happened to DeLorean afterwards. Because if in this documentary called Atari Game Over, which we'll touch on just a second here, you see the DeLorean itself. It's the actual DeLorean that was awarded over to Craig Queen. And so if, the obvious question is, well, why didn't Craig Queen have it? Well, Klein told him, hey, look, at any point, if you need to get rid of this DeLorean, even though I've just gifted it to you, here's my number, contact me, and I will take this off your hands, right? And so sure enough, I think Craig had it for just maybe a few years later. He calls him up, tells him, hey, I can't keep this anymore. Ernie takes it back, and now he's got two DeLoreans, right? The first world problems. He's got two DeLoreans, doesn't know what to do with them. Yeah. So as any good loving brother would do in this situation, Ernie actually gave the second DeLorean to his brother. So in that film, when you see Ernie Klein drive it in the documentary Atari Game Over, when you see Ernie Klein driving the DeLorean, that's actually his brother's, and he was actually en route to go pick it up.
I wondered why he took that road trip. I mean, it was cool to go see the ET cartridge, but that's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's what it was. He was picking up the DeLorean. He had actually lent it, so he had two of them, right? He put one on loan to what's his name, George R.R. Martin, the guy from Game of Thrones,
right?
He had lent one of the DeLoreans to him, so he actually went out to pick that up. Yeah, right. Lucky you. And so that's why you see that second one. So let's talk about it, and let's just talk about the documentary itself. So again, if you haven't had a chance to see this, I think I may have spoken about it on this show already. And let me just ask you, Neal, have you seen Atari Game Over?
Oh, absolutely. Well before this homework assignment. Yeah.
Yeah. No, good deal. I'd seen it myself even before all of this as well, because it's just it's a great documentary. I don't think it got the limelight that it deserved, because I think it released originally on Xbox TV or something that, they were toying with their own kind of movie channel that never really made it. But that's where it was originally released. But it's only like an hour and 15 minutes, hour and 20 minutes, and it's free on YouTube. So anybody that wants to go see it, you can go out there and take a look at it. But it really is kind of focused around this whole, what is it? The legend, the tall tale of all these Atari 2600 ET games that have been buried somewhere in New Mexico.
Out in the desert.
And growing up, I heard about this. Everyone had heard about this, right? It was something we talked about, but no one could verify whether or not that was true, or if it was, it was factual. Somebody made it up, and that's the whole premise of this documentary. It's Zach Penn on a personal mission to either prove or disprove whether or not there was indeed a ton of Atari 2600 cartridges, ET cartridges at that, buried somewhere in a desert in New Mexico.
And I love that it was really about the vindication, not just of the poor guy that managed that dump site, right? Who finally, people believed him and he's been claiming it, but really the programmer that created that poor game, in
Howard Warshaw.
in just a short amount of time. And look, I know about making games. And that's just a difficult thing to ask somebody to do. And so it was nice to see him feel a little bit of vindication and get a little recognition for something that was pretty amazing back then, even as bad as that game is. But
yeah. So in that documentary, so you got Zach Penn, you've got Mika, Howard Warshaw, which you talked about. Nolan Bushnell is interviewed in there as well. And it's really, it's as much about Atari and what they were going through and how that started up. And it started from basically nothing and turned into this just crazy successful company in just a matter of a year or two, really. But it's as much about that as it is about the myth of the Atari games. So again, if you get a chance, go check it out. It's definitely worth watching. Getting back to the DeLorean, so he gave it to his brother. That is now called EOD-88. And his brother is a huge Star Wars fan. So when you look at his DeLorean, as opposed to Ernie's is decked out in 80s pop culture. But his DeLorean, his brother's, is decked out in Star Wars stuff. So he's got like a R2-D2 that's on the back itself, like sticking out almost like an X-Wing. Yeah. You open it up. Inside there, the seat belts are the bandoliers that Chewbacca wears. He's got Han Solo's blaster in there. I mean, and there's so many things that he's done to this thing to customize it to make it look very Star Wars. I mean, it plays music and the whole 9 yards, really. I've got pictures. I think I posted them on the basement Instagram. He happened to be out here probably about 6 months ago. Both Ernie and his brother were out here at one of the theaters, and they were doing a special where you could get a signing and all that. But anyways, he had his DeLorean out there, and my son and I just took tons of pictures of it. It was just a great time to hang out with those guys and kind of talk to them. So what a great use of his money, right? You think about he worked hard for this. He got these, great rewards. And as a total geek, as a total pop culture fan, he's spending his money exactly the way that he should, Absolutely.
Right? A Star Wars DeLorean. Fantastic. Kudos.
Kudos. Right. So let me back up 1 second, because I have to get this story out. I want to talk about Mika. Mm-hmm. So are you familiar with him? And
I've met Mike.
I was going to say, have you met him?
Yep.
My guess is you probably have at some point. So he's known for a number of games out there, right? I mean, there's a ton of stuff that he's done. NBA Jam. He's done stuff recently, even stuff that, as old as, the Game Boy Color, and even before that, really. But one of the things that was interesting is, did you ever hear the story of how he proposed to his wife?
No.
Okay. So this is going to be great. I was going to say, don't spoil it if you have. So this is back in 1990. There was a game called Clax, and Clax had come out prior to 1990. It was a kind of a puzzle game that Atari had released. It was in arcades. They had done some ports, and Mika was on staff to try to port this game over into the Game Boy Color. Mm-hmm. They gave him 6 weeks to do it, which
sounds familiar.
Yeah, right. He had 6 weeks to pull this off. So he goes and calls all his buddies together and says, "Hey, I kind of need your help here. I'm on a really tight deadline." So they kind of pull their heads together. And they crank this thing out in like no time flat. The port's done. They've got a ton of time left over, and they've got a ton of ROM space left over on the cart. So he decides, hey, I'm going to throw some Easter eggs in this thing, right? So he creates one. In the US version, there's a knockoff of Snake that was created. Mm-hmm. And you enter a code, and it'll unlock the Snake game, right? In the European version, he created this Zelda knockoff. And I've never actually seen it, but I've seen an interview where he's talking about it. But the more important or more interesting one is the third Easter egg that he hid. So he had a girlfriend at the time, and they had been dating for some time. And he was finally ready to kind of pop this question. And so what does every successful game programmer do when they're ready to ask their partner for their hand in marriage? Yeah, they program in the game the proposal itself. So he embeds this proposal to his wife in the game in 1990's Clax for the Game Boy Color. There's like 3 years pass. Right. So he gets this game, gives it to his wife. She won't play it. She has no idea that it's in there. He doesn't want to spoil the proposal. And so 3 years pass, and then he gets a call from Tips and Tricks magazine. Tips and Tricks magazine is about to do their 100th issue, and they're reaching out to all these programmers and saying, hey, look, we need some codes. Give us your deepest codes, stuff that no one's unlocked, stuff that no one's found before. This is going to be a really special issue. And he's like, hey, yeah. I've got one. It's the proposal to my wife that never happened, right? Or to my girlfriend that's never happened. And so Tips and Tricks is like, well, hey, we'll help you. So they actually write this article, and they call out his wife's name in the article, basically saying, please play this game. You know, Mickey is her name. Please play this game. There's something in here for you in this game. So he comes home, he opens up the magazine, he lays it out. He lays out the Game Boy Color. It's laying right there, and he decides he's going to leave because he doesn't want to be there and when this happens. And so, thankfully, she picks up the magazine, she reads it, and realizes there's something going on here. She plays the game, she puts in the code, unlocks it, and in there's a picture of him and her. He's, I think she's she's leaning over, kind of kissing him on the cheek, and there's a message that says, "Mickey, will you marry me?" She says yes, thankfully, but. That's how he proposed to his wife. And that code, I mean, that marriage proposal, if you think about it, I mean, I don't know how many carts were printed or manufactured for Clax. It wasn't the most popular puzzle game, or it wasn't like, Dr. Mario or anything, or Tetris. But I think that's a cool story that somewhere out there, even to this day, if you have this code, you can see that personal message from Mike to Mickey and his proposal.
That's fantastic. I love it. I mean, it's an amazing story, absolutely. But does it surprise me about Mike? No, not at all. Right. But oh man, that's awesome.
And he's actually known for other things too. Like, and this is not in the show notes, so I apologize. I'm going to go on a tangent. He's known for other things too. Prior to this, he was known as the Donkey Kong Dad, and he had his daughter. I think I had to forget how old she was at the time. Was playing. You know, he's gone out publicly and said, hey, with my children, I've been trying to bring them in by playing the 8-bit stuff, and I'm kind of bringing them into 16 and 32 and that kind of, he's progressively bringing them into video games. And early on, he put his daughter, I forget, 4 or 5 years old at the time, put her in front of Donkey Kong. And she really loved Donkey Kong, the original arcade Donkey Kong, but she didn't like the fact that the main character was a boy. Mike decided, his daughter says, Daddy, can you make it a girl? This is literally what she says to him before she goes to bed that night. He stood up all night long, painstakingly reprogrammed Donkey Kong and made it so that it was Peach that was the main character. The
main character.
Yeah. Like, no big deal, right?
Yeah. Reverse engineering a ROM. Way to go.
Right. But that's what he was known for. And that went out on Reddit, and it got really huge. And suddenly everybody knew who Mike Mika was, even prior to what he did with the proposal here stuff. So he's a great guy. I mean, amazing guy. If you get a chance, go take a look at some of the interviews that are out there with him. And he's super down to earth. Follow him on Twitter too. He's got some great stuff that he posts from time to time.
Yeah. He's amazing. Not only in just the creative side of the games, but he actually was an editor at a gaming magazine called Next Generation. And this was out, probably in it was the
90s.
Yeah, it was mid 90s to late 90s. And it was the magazine. There was one in the UK that was sort of sister publication, but as somebody in the industry, like, we looked forward to that magazine every single month. It was well done. It was really smart people. They knew games inside and out. And I had a lot of respect. In fact, he joined up with a bunch of next gen folks, and that's how he started up basically Backbone Entertainment and also the Foundation 9 entertainment company, where they got a bunch of people that were tired of just writing about games and decided to go make them, and just had some fantastic ideas. And they built a couple of teams that did some amazing stuff. They were all based in the San Francisco Bay Area, just did some really phenomenal stuff, but they really specialized in that arcade emulation for the Game Boy and the Nintendo DS and the PSP. And did some really great stuff, especially porting like Dragon's Lair or Mortal Kombat. So yeah, some great work.
Well, let's do this. I guess we should bring this back to Ready Player One. So let's get back to the story itself. So Wade at this point is kind of in the novel, in this part of the chapter. And again, we're at the very tail end of the chapter. He starts mentioning that he talks about Dungeons and Dragons, and he mentions that both Halliday and Morrow were playing tabletop role-playing games in high school, and he rattles off a couple of them. He rattles off GURPS, Champions, Car Wars, and Rolemaster. And so I thought we could just start with GURPS really quickly.
Sure.
So GURPS was a game that came out in 1986. It the acronym stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. That's the GURPS, right? It was created by Steve Jackson Games, who, again, another Austinite, fellow Austin person. Yep. Have you ever met Steve Jackson?
No, I haven't met Steve. He's more in the clearly the tabletop side of things.
Yeah. I just wondered. But it's GURPS is one of those truly agnostic tabletop gaming systems, right? Like many of the systems that were out at the time, many of these game companies that were releasing tabletop games, because remember, this is when these games were still very hugely popular. Video games were popular, but this was a different time than it was today. They were chasing basically Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in terms of the model. And so what you had were people going, okay, well, we're going to come out with a science fiction role-playing game. It's got a completely different game system. Then we're going to come out with a medieval system. That's got a completely different game system. And now we want a espionage one, and that's got a different game system. And so me, growing up, I was going around and I was playing all these, but it was hard to keep track of rules, right? By the time you got into like your third or fourth game or campaign, you were really stressed to try to remember, okay, now is it this die? Is it that die? Is the rule apply here? It was very, very confusing. And so the idea here that Steve Jackson came up with is he was trying to come up with a game system that had a very core agnostic fundamental system in place that you could then spin off different versions of, right? So they were kind of all playing from that same sheet of music, if you will. And it was very successful. I had a number of, so personally, I never played GURPS, but I know a number of people that were really into GURPS and had preferred GURPS over TSR games, which I thought was just blasphemy, to be honest, because I was such a TSR kind of fanboy at the time.
Right.
But did you ever get into GURPS or at this point?
No, I was still kind of in the D&D camp at this point, but I had a ton of friends that kept trying to drag me into it. But yeah. I think it was really nice because, everything, up until 86, basically, it was just derivative of D&D. And a lot of the Tolkien stuff, right? It was just all, fantasy, sword and sorcery. And here you had the ability to go any way you wanted to. And what I liked, though, is that it added almost like a layer of math on top of the great storytelling, right? Mm-hmm. And so you had this universal set of rules like you talked about, and it didn't require you to have 15 different rule books all stacked around when you wanted to play. But yeah, it was really good, and it's still going. I mean, it's still going in the tabletop world.
Yeah. I don't know what version they're on, but even if you run into any one of the bookstores that are still around, you can see it there on the shelf. Different versions of it and that sort of thing. One of the cool things that I thought they did was this idea of character points, where they would take a character and they would kind of size the character based on all of the abilities and the equipment and that sort of thing. It kind of all had a point value to it. And at the end of the day, you had this kind of final sum of what that character was. And that ultimately kind of determined not necessarily its level, but it kind of gave you a rating for that particular character. And I make this akin to like something we see even today in World of Warcraft, right? You think about like World of Warcraft, you've got item levels, and you've got armor sets that have certain levels, and all that plays into it. And it just seems like that's just kind of, this is where a lot of this really started, is even back here and back then, which I think was a really cool concept. And obviously D&D, AD&D didn't do anything like this. In terms of the characters themselves, you had 4 basic attributes. You had strength, dexterity, intelligence, health, and they're for the most part very similar to, some of the other games, certainly like Dungeons and Dragons. You had, hit points. You've got different saving throws that you would make. You had something called advantages versus disadvantages, right? So you had basically perks that you could buy for your character. So your character might be really good at one particular aspect or one particular skill. And if you want to be even better or at more of those, you could. But the trade-off was you had to have a disadvantage applied to you, right? So you may be really good at, disarming bombs, but maybe you have trouble speaking. And that was kind of the trade-off there. So it was kind of neat. And you see this, this was one of the very first games that did it. And you see that even in other games, tabletop role-playing games that came out shortly after that. I think of I played the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle game for quite some time. And there was a very similar game mechanic there. And even in video games today, right? In role-playing games and MMOs, that kind of thing, there are certain things that are very similar here. So this is kind of a lot of where all of this started.
Oh, yeah. And they actually, I know I had heard that they tried to turn it into a video game system, right? Because they had this really great math system that you had all these, rules that sort of lent themselves right to a video game that could process that stuff. And from what I understand, the original Fallout was actually supposed to use this system, which, is a hugely popular role-playing video game. But what ended up happening, well, the rumor anyway, is that Steve Jackson Games, they didn't like some of the content. It was violent, it was very adult. And they sort of really objected to it. So the developers of Fallout just ended up sort of creating their own system. But for a while there, GURPS was going to make that leap into the world of video games.
That's awesome. Yeah, I had no idea. And you're talking about the original Fallout, like the isometric one that they
the original one. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I did not know that. So there is one other story that I want to talk about here with Steve Jackson Games. And this is kind of stepping aside from the game mechanics of GURPS and that sort of thing, but there was an event that occurred in October of 1988. And so I gave you this as a homework assignment. Did you get a chance to look into the Secret Service thing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Were you aware of this?
Yeah, we had heard about it, but I wasn't aware of what the final sort of actual awards. I know that, basically, I mean, do you want to describe the lawsuit or?
Yeah. So let me set the stage real quick. So we got to remember this is back in 1988. And in the years leading up to then, the telephone industry was pretty much a monopoly, right? It was owned by Bell Company, aka Bell System, aka the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or AT&T as we know it today. And this is before the big antitrust fund, right? They came and broke all that up because these guys were just kind of running the show pretty much all over the nation. And really, a lot of it was based on the fact that these guys owned much, if not all, of the proprietary technology that was used for analog phone systems. They were the keepers of the secrets, and they really loved that they were the ones that did this, right? So in 1988, Bell South, they find out that there's a document that contains information about their 911 technology, and it turns up on a BBS called Illuminati in Illinois. And I'll get to Steve Jackson Games in a second. So somewhere in Illinois, there's a BBS called Illuminati, and this particular manual for 911 technology shows up there. They report this to the Secret Service, and then in 1989, after there was an initial investigation, it was determined that it had been posted on that BBS by someone at Steve Jackson Games. That someone was an employee that was there at the time by the name of Lloyd Blankenship. Now, Lloyd Blankenship was indeed a member of the Computer Underground at the time. He wrote the Hacker Manifesto in 1986 under the handle of The Mentor, and he was acting as a consultant for Steve Jackson Games because they were writing a new book called the Cyberpunk Sourcebook for GURPS, right? So remember, this is right around the Blade Runner days, and Cyberpunk was really starting to pick up steam. Steve Jackson Games was trying to capitalize on this, and they were trying to come up with this Cyberpunk Sourcebook. So what would you do? You'd reach out to this subject matter expert who just happened to be Lloyd Blankenship at the time. So on the Secret Service was aware of Lloyd Blankenship, and they were hot for this guy. I mean, they wanted to get him, to know what he knew. Yeah, he was basically the poster child at that point for hackers and freaks and PH freaks kind of thing. And so then on March 1st, 1990, the Secret Service raids the headquarters of Steve Jackson Games, and they took 4 computers, 300 floppy disks, an assortment of other computer accessories, and 2 laser printers. And we'll talk about that in a second. Additionally, they took the master copies of GURPS Cyberpunk role-playing game, so those were confiscated as well. And all of this led to Steve Jackson Games basically almost laying off half of their entire workforce at the time, and they almost completely closed up shop. They, in return, filed a lawsuit against the Secret Service, and in 1993, they won. They won 2 out of the 3 claims. They got $50,000 in damages, $250,000 in legal fees, and this whole incident is now known as Steve Jackson Games versus the United States Secret Service. And as a result of all this, the positive side is this is the reason why now email is considered to be like physical mail in terms of a search warrant, because they didn't have a search warrant at the time. They literally busted down the doors of Steve Jackson Games headquarters here in Austin, took all this stuff under, really had on their own will. They just took it all. They didn't have to have a search warrant because this stuff wasn't protected. And today that is now protected because of this incident. And it really did a couple other things too. It yielded the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which kind of fights to this day for like net neutrality, open encryption, fair use, internet privacy, legal services for those that are that need them or are seeking them out. And the really kind of cool thing, all this is on top of all that, when that Cyberpunk Sourcebook was finally released, there in the bottom right-hand corner, if you go look at it, there's a little triangle and there's a little message. It says, the book that was seized by the Secret Service.
Yeah, they gave him credit.
They gave him credit. I mean, that alone, I remember. So I never played this again. I never played GURPS, but I remember this book when it came out, and that particular message was intriguing enough that I really, if for no other reason, I wanted to know why that book was seized by the Secret Service. So mission accomplished, and you can, they're probably thanking the Secret Service to this day for what they did, because I think that really helped, obviously sell that book more than
brilliant
anything
marketing move.
Great marketing move on the Secret Service behalf.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was surprised they didn't get any compensatory damages out of that, but I don't know how strong that case was, but it was a real watershed moment for everything sort of growing out of that, whether it was gaming or whether it was, internet, all of those things. So, I didn't realize just how small Steve Jackson Games were at that time. I thought it was a much bigger operation. But can you imagine having worked so hard on that GURPS Cyberpunk, and you're just about to release it, and poof, it's walking out the door.
Yep.
Oh,
yep.
Man.
And they never got it back. I mean, there's stories that they had to rewrite a lot of that stuff from just notes and things that were still laying around. I mean, they had to reconstruct much of the material from that because they never got that back. Any of the original source material that were taken on those original discs when the raid happened.
Rough.
Yeah. Well, Steve Jackson Games is doing okay to this day, thanks to Munchkin, but that's a topic for another day.
Ogre, yeah.
So let's talk about Champions. So this was Champions was another role-playing game. It was kind of a superhero setting that was set, and it was created by George McDonald and Steve Peterson. And again, this is another one. It's still going to this day. There's still,
it's huge.
Yeah, there's still material being created for it. And there's a lot of similarities here with GURPS in terms of maybe some of the game mechanics.
I think there's a lot of people that would make the claim that GURPS was probably inspired by Champions because, it came first.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I hadn't really even considered that, but yeah, and they both deal with this idea that you've got these character points, right? So that's kind of one of the big shining examples where they're both very similar. They've got a lot of the same abilities, the powers, the stats, all that. It all converts over into like this overall character level. But I think this one of the bigger selling points of Champions was just the number of character classes that it had in it. Now, Champions wasn't a game that I played. Again, I didn't play this one as much, although I did play the MMO a little bit later that we'll talk about here. But did you get a chance to play this growing up at all?
Oh yeah, I had all kinds of paper with little hexes on them. But because it was the superhero thing that really drew me, I sort of had gotten tired of the sword and sorcery stuff. It was just like the same. And so this one really, I mean, I'm a huge comic book nerd for years and years as well, both Marvel and DC. And so this was getting a little closer to that. Boy, did I wish that they had licensed either Marvel or DC, right? To play inside of the Champion system. But I was very happy that I had a superhero, RPG, and it was one of the earliest, point-by systems to be able to do that. And in terms of the books, I only had a couple of them, but there's like a stack of them. I mean, just tons.
Yeah, there's no end to these. And if you go to like the half price books today, you'll just see so many of them. Of different versions and all of that.
And the number of powers is just mind-boggling. Like if you ever want to write a story about superheroes and you need like some ideas about what powers to give them, go grab a Champions book and you'll have just this laundry list of powers.
Right. And it's funny because you mentioned Marvel, and the first thing that comes to mind is that stinker of a Marvel game that came out by TSR in like 84,
you mean Marvel
85?
Universe Online? Is that what you're thinking?
No, I'm thinking. So TSR, so the guy, the D&D folks, they actually did a Marvel superheroes role-playing game, and it stunk. Even as a kid, for me, at like, I don't know, I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, and I had some friends that were playing it. It wasn't a very fun game that I recall. And even though it had all the license, it had all the characters on it, they were all over the place on that thing. It just didn't do very well. Much different, to your point, than Champions, because this game system was so successful that it actually spawned an MMO in 2009 called Champions Online, which I had a blast playing. But really, it wasn't. I didn't go into that game because of Champions. I didn't go into Champions Online because of Champions. I went into that game because the studio behind it was Cryptic Studios, here based out of Austin. And Cryptic Studios had done City of Heroes back in 2004.
Oh,
that game, I was hook, line, and sinker into that game. I absolutely loved City of Heroes. It was like when I needed to get away from the drug addiction that was World of Warcraft, and I just wanted to, mellow out. I went to City of Heroes because that was in, again, 2004. And I just had so much fun. It was just a lot of fun to play. And it really felt like you were a superhero, that kind of thing. And so when I found out that they were doing Champions Online, I'm thinking, wow, you've got this incredible game studio called Cryptic Studios behind it. They just came off the success of City of Heroes. And now they're doing something that I've always had a very, very interest in, and that being the Champions game system. It was great. It was everything that I wanted, and it was just a lot of fun. And unfortunately, I only played it for maybe about a year or two. Maybe like 2010, 2011, I bowed out of that one. But it was just, I had the greatest time and met some really great people along the way. No,
the Cryptic Studios guys are phenomenal, and the way that Champions Online actually came about, they did a deal with Microsoft, because there was, it was right when the Xbox started, and Microsoft really wanted, a big, massive multiplayer, or at least an RPG game that you could do on the Xbox. It was brand new. They needed to fill that part of the lineup. And so they were going to do Marvel Universe Online.
Yeah, I remember this.
So they secured sort of the rights, and they brought in Cryptic, and just, they could never make it work. I don't know if Marvel pulled out. I don't know if it was Microsoft that pulled the plug, but I remember the day that Shane announced that it was dead. So Cryptic took that code from Marvel Universe Online, and that's what turned into Champions Online.
And if I'm not mistaken, did they not release some early footage of what that was looking like when they still had the Marvel license?
It was definitely at some events that they had a brand new console, right? They're going up against the PlayStation. They were going up against the Dreamcast at that point. And so they had to show something that was going to get people excited about it. So yeah, there was some promo stuff.
Yeah, well, so getting back to Champions and Champions Online, as far as the MMO, there's way too much to unpack, so we won't actually get into any of that. But the tabletop itself, again, is still going on. There's still people that are playing it. I was just loosely poking around on the internet and saw that there's, people that are doing regular gaming sessions, and I think there's even like a convention or something that they get together and stuff. So
not surprised.
Yeah, huge following. Great game. So kudos to those guys for what they did, because that's still going strong even to this day. The other one, so let's talk about Car Wars, and this one may be brief because so Car Wars was, it came out in 1980. It was a game that was released by surprise, Steve Jackson Games. Car Wars was kind of like it was a Mad Max it was basically based on, it was like Mad Max, post-apocalyptic. If you needed that kind of a fix, and you weren't playing something like TSR's Gamma World, this is where you went. And the whole game really was about you controlling different cars and the combat of the cars. So imagine you had these little punch-out cards. You put them down on the map. You had this little key thing that would tell you, angles, and I never played this, so you're gonna have to just bear with me here and bail me out if you've played this game.
I'm just waiting for you.
Yeah, right. So you would go up against these other cars, and that was really the gist of the game. It's some very, very humble beginnings, very simplistic thing. I mean, so much that when this thing was first released, they were packaging these things in like small ziplock bags, in 1980, and they were handing these out, which is very similar to Ready Player One and what Halliday was doing, right? In that he was handing this stuff out on Ziploc bags, and I guess that was just kind of the thing to do back then. But yeah. So anyways, you would play these little car games where you would, try to shoot other cars. So you could modify your cars. You could put like flamethrowers on there, or you could have an oil slick that ran behind you. You could soup up the engine. You could upgrade your tires and the armor, that kind of thing. And it really was just about battling cars. Well, when you weren't battling cars, you were in these like maybe like a demolition derby, or you went on these crazy death races, right, to try to get to the very end where you get all this money. And eventually they did introduce some like role-playing aspects, I think, a little bit later, where you had a character and abilities. I think they were trying to capitalize on a lot of that momentum that was in the mid-'80s by this point. But I don't know if that ever really kind of took off. It had its own magazine called Auto Do Quarterly, it had a huge following. And to this day, there are a lot of people that still play Car Wars. They're still making this thing. So let me pause there. But were you into this one as well, or did you see anybody busting out the little blocks and playing them?
I played this one, but not like early on. But later I did, and it's awesome, right? So you had like the ability to use the turn play card, right? And you're basically, figuring out. You have these huge maps, right? It's like a big giant grid system.
Yeah.
And so you could design your own, but more importantly, you just had access to a ton. And that magazine was awesome because it kept extending the game, right? It kept introducing new maps and new cars. But one of the coolest parts of it was that you made little models of the actual cars, right? So they had some that came inside the rule books that you could like cut out, heaven forbid, or go photocopy, more importantly. Mm-hmm. And you built these little kind of cardboard cars. And then a bunch of people started using micro machines like to fit on the little maps and stuff so that they could have cooler representations. But it just had the roadways, and you moved your car basically by rolling the dice, and you had it was almost like a character sheet for the cars, right?
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And so it worked like you had classes for suspensions and you could buy armor and all this different stuff. So it was almost like the cars were the people from the other role-playing games.
Wow.
And the number of expansions was awesome. Like there was a helicopter one, and there was an off-road one, and like just these maps of the countryside that would fill basically, a 4-foot gaming table that had all kinds of road conditions, and you had like city maps where you could crash into the buildings. And anyway, I'm getting kind of geeked out here, but
yeah, that's cool.
But it's a really great game because it's just so different from all the rest, especially around the early 80s. It just was a great alternative to the rest of the kind of the D&D stuff.
And certainly in the time when, and we've talked a bit about this on the show, but video games really left a lot to your imagination, right?
Yeah.
You had some great artwork going into a lot of these games, in 1980, but the reality is you were dealing with some really blocky stuff. And so having something as intricate as this and something more tangible like a physical car, whether it be the punch outs or the micro machines, that was just kind of a whole new level in terms of gameplay, right?
Yeah, you're spot on. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right, so the last one is Rolemaster, and Rolemaster came out in 1980. It was released by Iron Crown Enterprises, which so here's another one. I never played this one, but for whatever reason, that logo for ICE was this fancy schmancy logo that I always saw on the books, and it stood out. It always stood out. So kudos to them for their marketing and the branding that they did. But anyways, it came from the minds of Coleman Charlton, John Curtis, Pete Fellon, and Steve Marvin. And the idea around Rolemaster initially was that they were going to release these modular books that would kind of replace portions of other popular pen and paper games. And so really let's just be real. They were talking about Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Right.
So you could just kind of buy this one particular book, supplement a subset of rules within AD&D with their rule book. Well, they released so many of these that by 1984, I think they had enough that they really just had their own game system at that point. And so from that point on, they kind of had what they called their standard system. And from there, they've had, there's tons of these. There's like the Rolemaster Fantasy Role-Playing, Rolemaster Classic, Rolemaster Express, Unified Rolemaster, which was kind of the one rule set to kind of bring them all together, to rule them all, if you will, that they released. And that was pretty recently. I want to say it was at least in the last 5-10 years or so that they released that one. And growing up, again, I remember seeing these books on the shelves like at Walden Books, and I never played them, and I didn't know anybody who played these games. As I was doing the research, it dawned on me that this was hugely popular in the UK, which probably explains why we had the books here, but it just wasn't, I don't know. People were more, I think, into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons or some of the other alternatives at the time than this one. But I'm going to ask the same question here. Was this something that you got into? Do you remember Rolemaster, or do you remember Iron Crown Enterprises and some of the stuff that they were doing?
I just know Rolemaster because it was just, I mean, it was everywhere, right? And I mean, it was very much derivative of, D&D, especially the reason that it was so big in the UK was kind of the Tolkien influence. That, I mean, it was all about Middle Earth and Tolkien style characters.
Yep.
But it was really nice because, like, from talking to some of my friends, basically it was really a way to formalize the outcomes. Like, instead of making it so random that, when you got a good dungeon master, you got a game going in D&D, they wanted to kind of formalize those things. And so they really kind of applied a lot of tables and math and all this to kind of get better ways of outcomes. So you had these offensive bonuses and defensive bonuses and modifiers they got down to like wounds and your position and like weapon and attack tables. And I mean, it was really sophisticated. So it appealed to an audience that really wanted, something a little bit more. And they just ended up printing a ton of books. Oh my gosh.
I mean, yeah. And nonetheless, it was very, to your point, very successful, hugely popular. There was a write-up in Arcane magazine in 1996 that kind of summed up the review with, it says, quote, "On the other hand, if you're not one for tables and calculations, it's probably not going to ring your bell." So consider me unrung, because that was the one thing that I would say, I get what they were doing and I can appreciate that. I really do. The thing that I really enjoyed about, and we'll talk about this here when we get into D&D and AD&D, the one thing that I really enjoyed about games like the basic set of Dungeons and Dragons, or I think of like the Star Wars role-playing game that came out from West End Games in around 87. Paranoia is another one that came out. Those games had less focus on the game system and a lot more flexibility just to move the story forward, right? It was more about the experience.
Yeah.
And that's what was really intriguing for me from a player and even from a dungeon master perspective. I really enjoyed that more than the charts and the, min-maxing of abilities and that kind of thing. And I can see where I know people to this day that play MMOs, and that's really what they're in for. They're not in for role playing. They're not in for anything else, but then just to crunch numbers and be the best that they could be numerically, right, from a statistical standpoint.
Right. You're a story guy.
Yeah, no, I'm a story guy. Yeah, right, exactly it. So yeah, it wasn't probably for everybody, but nonetheless, very successful. Yeah,
I like that. They got so popular with a lot of people. Not necessarily me, but a lot of my friends. They got really popular so that D&D started recognizing that the GURPS and Rolemaster were starting to eat into their market share, right? And so when they were going to do a big version of D&D, I think it was like 3E, they actually went and recruited designers from the Rolemaster teams and the GURPS teams to kind of freshen or update D&D to bring it more towards that, because it was blowing up so much, and that in turn caused a huge controversy amongst the D&D world. But anyway, it was interesting that it had that big an effect back on the granddad.
All right, let's talk Tomb of Horrors, and before we get to kind of the anchor, which is going to be AD&D. So, Tomb of Horrors. It is a module that came out in 1975. It was written by Gary Gygax, and he wrote that for play and use at the first Origins convention, which is kind of like this annual gaming convention that started in 1975. So it's really focused on tabletop role playing. It's labeled as S1. So every one of the modules. So let me back up for those our listeners that aren't familiar with role playing games and how this all works. But you buy the core books. You got all your core rules. And then you would go out and either make, as a dungeon master or a referee, game master, whatever that role is, you would either make your own adventures for the characters to go through, or you can go buy these pre-made, fabricated adventures that someone else wrote and run your players through those. This was one that was written by the maker himself, Gary Gygax, and the number was S1. And the S stood, every one of the modules had like a letter and then like a number. The S stood for special because this was a special one that was released again at the Origins convention. It was for characters levels 10 through 14, and it took place in the campaign world of Greyhawk, which we've spoken about here on this show before. Now, it's been reported by anyone who's ever written a piece about this particular module that this was Gary Gygax's statement, right? He was trying to make a statement here to kind of humble both the experienced players that he had in his own personal campaign, but then the hordes of hundreds of other people that were players that would all go on and boast about how amazing and how powerful their characters were, how great their abilities were, how amazing their gear was. Because that was kind of it at the time, right? That was a whole lot. You would sit there and brag about, well, I've got a +2 sword, or I've got a +3 sword, or I have this, I have a bag of holding. You'd go on and boast about this. And he was really trying to kind of humble the playing field. And so he creates this thing called the Tomb of Horrors, which is arguably just sadistic. I mean, it's horrible. The name is so relevant. It is a module with the sole intent of killing the player characters. So as a dungeon master, anybody that I knew that was running people through this, I thought, why would you, either you don't like them or they know going in that they're doing this just to kill the characters off, right? So you mentioned, I think, before we came on there, that this was something that you had played, that you had been through the Tomb of Horrors before. Did you ever complete it? And how many times did you actually go through this thing?
Oh, no. Did I ever complete it? No, it wasn't that good.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I actually got really frustrated with it. I mean, I can look back now and appreciate the genius, a little box of humility for some of the folks that, had been, really huge fans of D&D and making all these claims. But to me, it was like, no, I just got so frustrated not being able to get through it. I didn't want to look at a demi-lich ever again.
Yeah.
And so basically just kind of gave up on it. And it was so interesting that the first time I ever went back to even look or think about it was Ready Player One.
Yeah, it hasn't. I mean, it certainly has its place in, the lore of Dungeons and Dragons, and they've made a number of sequels. I mean, there's been, they did a sequel called Return to the Tomb of Horrors in, I think it was 1977, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong on that one. I probably should have looked that one up.
I think it was a little later than that.
Yeah, I think it was in 98. I think it was in 77 or 78 they did the monochrome release. And then it was later on, 98, they did Return to the Tomb of Horrors, and they did that for 2nd edition. But I mean, they've done I want to say they did 3rd, 4th edition variants of the original Tomb of Horrors. They've just, in 2017, they re-released this thing for the 5th edition, which is the most recent one for Tomb of Horrors as well. So it's still out there, it's still alive, and it's still killing even to this day. We won't get into, I don't want to get into the actual module today, because Chapter 8 is really where we're going to kind of sink our teeth into what this module is and some of the traps and things that were going on. But there were 2 things that I found very interesting that were write-ups at the time. Write-ups about the module itself, maybe not at the time, but the first one is from Wired Magazine, which said, this is a Dungeons and Dragons adventure created in 1978 for the purposes of testing the wit and fortitude of adventuring parties at game tournaments. Testing, and that's in quotes, testing is used here in the same sense as the sentence, we'll be testing the dog for rabies. Let's just say the subject is not expected to survive the procedure, right? So that right there kind of sums up what these characters go through and just how tormented you are going through this particular module. And then the other one was this was a little bit more mellow, but in the words of the creator, this is a thinking person's adventure. It was designed not for player characters of a certain level, though high-level adventures are certainly necessary, but for players who enjoy mental challenge and DMs who want to put their own spin on a truly unique dungeon. And that probably says it all right there. It is a very, very unique dungeon. There really wasn't anything else out there at the time. It almost seems like it's almost kind of it almost seems very basic in terms of what it's trying to do, right?
Well, it was a watershed, right? Because it was like
Exactly.
it was the very first module where you weren't going in and just killing a ton of monsters, right? It was more that collection of puzzles and maps. It was much more cerebral, for lack of a better term. But it was, it's focusing on those traps rather than the monsters themselves to try and surprise people, right? And so it really delighted the hardcore folks, not like me where it just frustrated. But the hardcore folks were like, this is a whole new world that I didn't realize that, D&D as early as it was there could go in.
And then on top of all that, you had a Sararak, right? The Demi-Lich. Throughout the entire module, he's telling you that he's going to kill you. So should you get through all of the traps, at the very end, you had to face him, which obviously plays into the novel in a huge way. And again, we'll come back to that when we get to chapter 7 and then certainly in chapter 8. So, but do you have any final thoughts before we move on from 2 and 4? Because I want to kind of wrap this up with Dungeons and Dragons here.
No, I'm excited for you to kind of dive in a little bit deeper, and I don't want to spoil anything for that.
Yep. All right. Well, we're here. It's finally the big one, the big kahuna of fantasy tabletop role-playing games. Yes, we're talking about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or AD&D, as it's commonly known in the industry. Again, we've touched on aspects of Dungeons and Dragons in previous episodes. We talked about Gary Gygax already. We did it tonight. We've talked about Greyhawk. We've talked about Dark Elves. And honestly, the novel makes a crazy amount of future references too. So this won't be like the final be-all, end-all breakdown of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I kind of want to do something for that at some point because I really want to get into a lot more than just talking about the game. I want to talk about the origins and that kind of thing. But let's touch a little bit there and start there. It started in 1977. It was created by Gary Gygax. The first book that was released was the Monster Manual. And so he had released this Monster Manual that was supposed to be used for the Dungeons and Dragons box set, the basic set as we know it today. It was followed up in 1978 with the Player's Handbook, the first official Player's Handbook that was labeled Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then finally, rounding out the kind of holy trinity of books was the Dungeon Master's Guide, which came out in 1979. And really, what these books did was he took the basic Dungeons and Dragons set and he just breathed so much air into it, right? You've got a lot more structure, more details, tons of rules that the basic set didn't really explicitly cover. And this is kind of the point that we were making earlier. There was a lot left to interpretation by both the players and the Dungeon Master in the basic set. And this was just a way of kind of, putting a frame around it, for
right.
lack of a better term. He really framed a lot of the stuff that was ambiguous or people were debating about whether it meant this or that. It was very definitive in terms of where it was going, but it wasn't overly, there wasn't a huge barrage of rules. There are a lot of rules, but it wasn't to the point where it got in the way of gameplay. At least I never felt that it got to that point. Let me pause here. How much did you play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and did you get in on first edition, or was it a little bit later?
No, it was a little bit later on AD&D.
Yeah.
We in high school was where we started picking up D&D because that's all we sort of had access to. We didn't have amazing bookstores that had, we couldn't go on Amazon and order, all the stuff.
Right, yeah.
And so it really kind of was left up to the genius, right, of your DM, your dungeon master. And what was great is a lot of theater nerds at the time, this fit perfectly to, what we wanted to do. You had a DM that had a really great imagination. And then you had players that were kind of used to doing some theater stuff, improv. And so it made it a little more interesting because it's, it was kind of like, it was like a choose your own adventure as a group.
Yeah.
And everybody builds off of each other. And that's the best, the best part of it is, it's, if everyone's just a little bit creative, then it kind of blows up bigger than just a bunch of tables. And, it was the story that kind of kept us coming back. It wasn't, what did you roll with your, 20-sided dice? It was more about what was the story. And that's what was nice. And with AD&D, basically you got to do, it just took it to a whole new level where you got a lot more to it. And it started for me making it maybe, I don't know, a little more complicated and maybe too structured. Mm-hmm. Where you didn't have that kind of freedom, but I can see where somebody's just starting out. Yeah, that just fits perfectly, right? You've got much more weapon proficiencies. You've got, kind of skills and all these things where you can kind of hang a framework on it for noobs. And it makes more sense there. Yeah. Not that one's better than the other, but for me, it was like it kind of constrained stuff a little bit more.
Yeah, that's fair. And they really, this two-prong approach I mean, they lived with this for years, where they had like the basic set, and then you had the advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and it was always, as I was trying to introduce new people to the game, it was always something I felt I always ended up having to kind of explain it, and I never really did a good job of trying to explain the differences between the two at the time. I was just too young. Now I get it, but at the time I'm like, I don't know. Yeah. One's in a box, one's in a book. I don't know what to tell you.
That's as basic as you can get.
Yeah. And to this day, I mean, I still have some first edition books. I've got some second edition. I'm looking at my bookshelf here, and I've got those. I've got I still have the original, the basic sets when they were doing the different colored boxes, right? So you had like the red for the basic, the expert set was blue, the companion set was the aqua blue, the master set was black, and then you had like the immortal set, which I never got. That was the gold boxes, and they were on that. And then when you open those boxes up, they had kind of like the paper backings for those books for both the player and the DM guides. But then on the AD&D side, you had these really nice hardbound books.
Oh,
right.
Gorgeous.
The artwork was amazing. You had like Jeff Easley, Larry Elmore, some of these just legendary artists at the time that were cranking out stuff for TSR. It just felt like a very different game, and they weren't compatible, right? I mean, you could.
No, on purpose.
Yeah, and exactly right. It was purposeful. They were trying to keep that separate. But and there were people that were out there trying to do conversion stuff, right? You could get stuff in Dragon Magazine that would show you how to convert items from the basic set over into AD&D and vice versa. But that was all, part of their two-prong approach to trying to sell all of this. And eventually, it wasn't, I think, until third edition, and keep me honest, but it wasn't until third edition that they finally said, you know what, we're done. It's just called Dungeons and Dragons now. And there's no AD&D, there's nothing advanced about it. It's just Dungeons and Dragons, and that's where we are today. It's just one particular set. Yeah,
and in your experience, did you have people kind of raging against each other of like one versus the other?
No, I think I had a really great group and I had several groups growing up, but I had a lot of great groups, role-playing groups, that we kind of knew that when we really wanted to, like in the summertime, here's a good, when it was school time, let me start here. When it was school time, we were playing Dungeons and Dragons. When we got to the summer, where we had a lot more time, we would play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
Because the D&D stuff, you could just pick up, play, put it down, you go back to school, right? But the AD&D stuff was just so much more detailed, and there was just so much more there. And the Dungeon Master had a lot more knowledge and rules and things to kind of flesh and mature their campaigns with, that it made sense that because we had nothing to do in the summer but make our parents upset, we'd go play AD&D and spend all our time, literally day and night, playing this stinking game. So
just like the Stranger Things.
Yeah, it was very similar. Oh, don't even get started. I see that and I'm like, that's me right there.
Yeah. I mean, to take a step back, I talk about how much both, D&D and AD&D have impacted literally the world of video games, because of course that's the lens I'm going to look through. But you think about just anything that has hit points, anything that has experience points or EXP, race, classes, any of that was because of Gygax's work. Yeah. I mean, it really is amazing, because we take all this stuff for granted, right? It's around us all the time, and people picking up, these video games now, not so much the tabletop, because that's easier to understand, but they pick up these video games and have no idea how much is owed to Gygax specifically, but all the folks that kind of surrounded D&D. It's kind of impressive. And you think about, the massive multiplayer stuff, any game where literally the story of the game lived beyond just that one session that you played, that's a tribute to Gygax and all of this stuff happening back in the 70s.
Great point. You're right. You see those traces today, right? It's all connected tissue from way long ago. And so when you were growing up as a kid and you were playing Dungeons and Dragons, is there anything that stood out for you? Was there any particular like experience or a module that you played, a campaign maybe that you look back and just think that was the life right there? Really enjoyed that time.
My all-time favorite was Ravenloft.
Oh yeah.
It was.
So are you talking second edition? Or are you talking about the module?
The module.
Okay.
And And so, yeah, it kind of came out during, I think it was like my last year in high school. That's how old I am. But I mean, the whole thing about the vampires, right? And Strahd and just like it. So it was the story, right? Mm-hmm. Just like you, it wasn't just about, points and this, that. It was like, there was a story, he loved that girl and the maps of the castle. And, just like it was this epic quest that had just a great story behind it. And it was vampires. Let's all be honest. They're super cool. And so I love that it was a mix of like, a straight up dungeon crawl, but it had this awesome story to sort of back it up. So yeah, that to me was like one of my fondest memories, and it's been a long time since I've gone back. But it really stuck out. Maybe it was the friends I played with. But it seemed like it was because of the quality of the game. Probably a little bit of both. Yeah, no, that was a great module. In fact, I know TSR reproduced that as part of their, was it the 20th anniversary box set that they did? Or maybe it was 30th. Yeah, there's been a bunch of sequels for sure. Yeah. And that was so hugely popular that when second edition came out, and what I meant to say, what I meant to ask you was whether you were talking about Ravenloft, the campaign, versus Ravenloft, the module. You're talking about the module, but in second edition, they were spawning all these different campaign settings. Ravenloft was one of them, and I loved everything about Ravenloft, the campaign. Yeah. We had all of the books, we bought all of the supplement materials and stuff like that. But the campaign setting itself had some very unique features, especially when nighttime came around. Nice. But yeah, it was great stuff. That book, they did a book. I don't know if you ever read I, Strahd, I think is what it's called. It was about Strahd. It was written from his perspective. And I think it's kind of the events that lead up until the point where that module starts it, right? Yeah, I mean, he made a great villain, but he also not humanized him, because that makes weird sense when he's a vampire. Yeah. But I mean, it just it made him real, so that you really had to think about whether you were going to kill this guy. Yeah. Right. Oh yes. Strahd von Zarovich or whatever. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. So that, those campaigns, all of them, and they did a ton of them. I mean, that was probably one of the more successful ones, but they did like a Dark Sun campaign that was set on this desolate, molten hot planet where, nothing lived. They had like a Arabian Nights one, Al-Kazim. Sounds like Chronicles of Riddick. Yeah, no, right, very similar to that. But this was at the height. And if I had to think back on like a particular moment or time period where I felt like this was just the best moment to be alive with Dungeons and Dragons, I would have to go back to that same period. For me, it was second edition, and it was just a number of different campaign settings that were out there. And I'm overlooking the biggest and the best. And my personal favorite that to this day I've read all the novels for, and that's the Forgotten Realms campaign setting, right? Nice. That whole second edition and just how vast. I mean, it was probably overkill, right? Now that I think about it, I was investing so much of my limited paychecks at the time into buying these books. And they were not sympathetic for my lack of funds. They just kept cranking these things out, and I just kept buying them. But like it's a business or something. Yeah, right. Well, silly them. But yeah, they did a lot of great stuff. There was just so much material, but it was a great time to really be into playing Dungeons and Dragons, because there was no end to the number of games that were out there, the number of themes that were out there, systems that you could play and all that. So it was just a really great time. So getting back to Dungeons and Dragons specifically, did you ever hear how the name was picked, or how the name was decided that it would go? No. So Cindy Gygax is the one that named this. And Cindy Gygax is the daughter of Gary Gygax. So when she was 2 years old, Gary gave her a couple different names, and she picked Dungeons and Dragons because she liked that one the best. And that's really the story. Now, there's some variations to the story. I've heard that his wife, Mary Jo, actually picked the name. But in any case, I just think it's cool that whether it's the wife or the daughter, that it's a family name that came, it was a family member that came up with the name Dungeons and Dragons. So that's awesome. I mean, come on, the guy's name already, Gygax, he sounds like a character in a novel. Or a comic book. He's got the alliteration thing going on there. Exactly, like already. Yeah. That's fantastic. Let's talk quickly about the game highlights, because I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, and we're not going to get into everything. But
this is really, it's kind of the blueprint that was used for everything that would come, afterwards. It used a lot of different dice, first off, right? There were 4-sided, 6-sided, 8, you had 12. You had the percentile dice, right? The 10-sided dice. And then you had the big one, which was the 20-sided die that was primarily used for attacking, to determine if you were successful in attacking or, something else. We got the concepts of like a natural 20s, right? That meant you always hit, and a 1 always meant that you missed whenever you were attacking with that 20-sided dice. Just to make a reference to the movie really quickly in Ready Player One, the 20-sided die can be seen in the, the Orb of Osiovox? I'm probably going to mess that name up because I didn't write this down.
Yep.
But the orb itself is a 20-sided die. It's pretty subtle, but if you look closely when you're watching that part of the movie, when he pulls it out,
makes perfect sense.
You can see that it's a 20-sided die. There were 6 primary abilities. You had strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, con, and charisma. I could recite those by heart because anytime you had to make a character sheet, you had to just write them down, right? Strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity. So those are your kind of primary abilities. With the first edition of Dungeons and Dragons, you had a couple different races. You had dwarves, elves, gnomes, half-elves, halflings, half-orcs, and humans. And we were talking about this before we came on the air. At one point, I guess it was the Tolkien group, or I don't know who that entity is, but they were actually coming after these guys because it's no secret, right? A lot of what you see in AD&D and its origins was kind of stripped directly from Tolkien, and I don't think they were really happy about that.
Yeah, if you were nice, you would call it inspired. But if, we're being realistic with each other, it was a complete ripoff. And you think about it, that Tolkien and those, series of books just permeated that world so much that we've never been able to get away from that, right? Think about all the video games and everything. It's all kind of going back to that intellectual property in some way or another.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, I'm saying that we're giving a lot of credit to D&D for a lot of this stuff, and it goes back to Tolkien books. But I guess some other interesting things about those races. I think at one point they were called hobbits, and he had to change the name. So instead of hobbits, now we have gnomes. Or halflings, I should say.
Halflings,
halflings. There's another one that the Ents, right? The Ents that we know from the Lord of the Rings stuff. They were originally called Ents in D&D, and they had to change the name to Treants. So,
thank you, Two Towers.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Two Towers. So those are the races. As far as the classes, you had clerics, you had fighters. You had basically 5 primary classes: cleric, fighter, magic user, thief, and monk. And then there was a subclass for cleric called druid. There was subclasses for the fighter, which were the paladin, the overpowered paladin, the ranger. And then for magic user, you could be an illusionist. And then for thief, you could be an assassin. Did you play any of those? I guess, of course you did. What was your favorite? What were you picking?
I had 2 favorites. One was a human cleric. Mm-hmm. That went by the name of Mosiah, by the way.
Oh, nice.
And it was awesome because he was like a pirate. Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah, I see.
And then I had a half-elf bard, and his name was Bungdaba.
Bungdaba? Where did the origin come from that?
Yeah, it was a buddy of mine, had a little brother and was really little, and that was like what he could say at the time. And so we actually started years later, a company named Bungdaba where we did computer consulting stuff. And it was funny because I used that name for my character for a while.
Nice.
Wow. This is all coming out here on the podcast.
All right.
I love it.
Bear your testimony. The other thing that was really a lot of fun to play around with was your alignment, right?
The dark side.
Yeah. So, and this is the funny thing, because even to this day, when I'm sizing people up, I give them an alignment. In real life, I do. I promise you, it's a true story. Like, that guy's neutral, and that guy's chaotic good. But it's true. You can apply this to people in real life if you're weird like me.
Oh yeah, you draw a graph, you can do it.
If you draw a graph, right? Was there any alignment that you felt like you always played, or did you mix it up from time to time?
No, I tried to mix it up a little bit. It was hard to go sort of to the dark side, and I wasn't a fan of being chaotic just because it was my own sensibility.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was. I tended not to branch out too far.
Yeah. So if you think about it I'm going to try to visualize this for you, but the alignments, there was basically 9 alignments. Smack dab in the middle was true neutral, right? If you went far up to the left quadrant, you were lawful good, which was the goody two shoes of them all. In the opposite direction, bottom right-hand quadrant, you were chaotic evil, which was just, pure evil incarnate. And then there were different variations thereof. But I would always joke, first off, I always played chaotic good characters. I don't know what it was. I think it was just, that was how I pictured Han Solo. He was,
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah,
so
absolutely.
I was like, okay, I want to be Han Solo. I'm going to be chaotic good. I always tended to play chaotic good. And then every once in a while, I'd toy around with neutral good. And if I really wanted to make a lot of people mad, I'd play lawful good. But conversely, the people that, so here's the thing that I would always joke about. When you played with other people that were lawful good, you knew where they stood, right? There was no question about what they were going to do. They were very predictable in that way. And same
neutral.
Same thing with, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Same thing with chaotic evil. You had to watch your back and they were going to screw you over at some point, no matter what happened, every opportunity they could get. Very predictable. The person you wanted to watch out for was the true neutral person. You had no idea what this nutcase was going to do to you in the adventure while you were playing. And those are the people that I was always worried when I'd get into, because sometimes, we'd have regular gaming groups, right? But every once in a while I'd venture out, head over to, the local comic shop that was doing Saturday night gaming night. And I'd, bring in my character and play with a bunch of random people. And the minute we were going around announcing our alignments and someone said neutral, I'm like, all right, that guy, first chance I get, you're out of here, buddy. I'm taking you out.
Especially chaotic neutral.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Good point. Yeah. Neutral was crazy, but chaotic neutral, that was definitely, you got to go. An accident's going to happen in this campaign and you're going to be on the receiving end of it.
It was nice knowing you.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. All right. So game mechanics, saving throws, right? That was a big thing. It was basically a number that would, you would roll dice against to kind of help lessen damage, whether it be fire or dragon breath, acid, poison, these kind of things that would kill you almost instantly. You mentioned hit points, right? To this day, that's universally used in just about every video game out there, from fighting games to adventure games, role-playing games. You had armor class. It introduced, different combat skills and modifiers for your attributes, right? Very, very intricate system in terms of what they were trying to do. But, excuse me, at some point, again, I'd like to dedicate a whole show to Dungeons and Dragons and specifically TSR, because there's just so much history there that you could really break down a lot of this stuff more than just the books and the dice and the accessories, but really get into kind of how all that started. But there was always something cool, I felt like, growing up playing Dungeons & Dragons, even though I was ridiculed to no end as a kid. Because in 7th grade, in one hand, I had my books that I was going to school with, but I was that kid from Stranger Things. I had my, player's handbook that I just carried with me everywhere, because you never know, right? You never know when something's going to come up.
When a game's going to break out.
Exactly. You gotta have it open and ready. And I had all my dice in my pocket and that sort of thing. But there was no end to the ridicule that we got growing up. I think, at least me and my own perspective growing up, being teased for playing this. And I had some friends, and, during lunchtime, we were the kids that would go find a corner where no one really was looking and break out the books and, read, or we weren't playing. There was not enough time to play. But we'd get in there and start having these debates and topic discussions about the rules and how to, our own kind of house rules that we had changed, and how do you get around this? And this is what we do. This is what I do, that kind of thing. That was always just fun. It was a very small group of people growing up. And I was going to ask, was that similar for you? Were you that into the game where you were bringing this stuff to school and kind of publicly talking about this? Yeah,
that's the only place we could play. I mean, we didn't live anywhere near each other, and nobody drove at that point. So it was like school was it. After school, it was Mr. Delvey's room. And that's where you just went. You ran to your locker first to get your book, and came there, and you just hoped and prayed that, that you could keep it quiet till then. It definitely wasn't something that we broke out at lunch. I don't think we were quite that brave. So hats off to you, Albert. You try to move in different circles during lunch,
right,
but it was, for a while. it just, we would go from thing to thing to thing. And for a while it was D&D. And God, I still remember my very first game. I remember Robert, a friend who I haven't seen since we left high school, but he was like super into this and was like, you've got to come and play this. And I'll never forget, right? I'll never forget like him trying to go easy on me as my very first, dungeon master, and, still have great memories of that kind of stuff. But, definitely it was a nerd club at that time, and even reading comic books at that time, right? Yeah. It was definitely not the cool thing that it is now. All that stuff sort of wrapped up together.
No, all good points. I want to do the same thing. I was into Dungeons and Dragons as early as maybe, I would say I probably got in about 80. And that was only because I had an older cousin who was really into it. And I had no idea what I was doing, right? They were just telling me, now roll that die. Okay, now you're dead. But I had, it wasn't until I got to probably 6th grade, I think, that I was really, that's kind of when I went all in. And I have to thank somebody named Jeff Munoz, who is still a good close friend of mine. We still keep in contact to this day, but he was the one that really introduced me and opened my eyes to role-playing games and the Commodore 64 and comic book collecting and all the other stuff that I've come to know and love. So thank you, Jeff, for doing that, because I wouldn't be where I am without having, befriended him, and just the amount of time that we would play at, over with overnight parties and sleepovers and during the summer. And he was just ate all this stuff up, and I was right there with them eating all of it up as well. So thank you. I want to talk just quickly, because I don't want to miss this, but the name of this episode is called The Game Wizards. And the reason why we call it, or at least the reason why I picked that, was because in 1980, TSR, their logo, it ran from like mid 1980 to mid 1982. It was only 2 years, but their logo said TSR, and underneath it said The Game Wizards. And that logo, for whatever reason, and maybe to be fair, a lot of these, even afterwards, the next 3 or 4 versions of the TSR logo all stood with me for different things. They were almost kind of like milestone markers in my life and where I was and what I was doing at the time. But that one always resonated with me the most, because it just the tagline of The Game Wizards. And I don't know that it was ever used again in any of their in their logos, but it just stood out. It stood out. That little tagline was just a cool thing to say. So yeah, that's where it's from.
Nice.
All right. We're at the very end here. I do want to just touch on one last thing, because we were kind of, before we came on the air, we were talking about some of the pop culture stuff and the legacy here around Dungeons and Dragons. And the one thing that always came to mind is a lot of the controversy that came from people that were taking their life. All right, for this game, I guess, is how it was falsely accused. I was telling you, I wasn't allowed. I mean, I did all this in the secrecy of my mom. We weren't allowed to play Dungeons and Dragons because it was the work of the devil. And Mom, devout Catholic that she wasn't about to let me play anything that had any reference to demons or dragons or any of this stuff. And that kind of almost fueled me to want to play it even more.
Nice.
But there was a lot of controversy when this game came out. 60 Minutes did a special at one point early on in the 80s, where they were kind of trying to dive into whether or not there was any, truth behind people taking their lives, getting too wrapped up in playing this game. There was a kid, I think he went to Michigan University. I might be mistaken there, but I think he was like 16, 17 years old, pretty young kid, really smart kid. But he tried to commit suicide that had nothing to do with this game. But then when the media got hold of it, there was a lot of sensationalism around it, and they were trying to pin the fact that he was a Dungeons and Dragons player on him suddenly being detached from reality, and that this game was kind of had driven him to try to take his life, and he eventually did. Unfortunately, he killed himself. That spawned a book called Mazes and Monsters by Rona Jaffe, and that would eventually get turned into a movie that starred Tom Hanks. And so, again, this is right around the early 80s that a lot of this was going on, and it's just really one of many things in our history that's kind of the fall guy, for mental health issues, right? Rock and roll was in there at one point. You mentioned video games. I mean, how many times did we hear video games are the work of the devil?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a lot. And if we're all honest with each other, there's some content in video games that are, pretty questionable. Sure. But to I think what happens is that when you have a really heartbreaking story like that, parents as well as the media want the simplest answer.
Mm-hmm.
I just want one thing that I can target or that I can feel is responsible for what happened. And it decouples that poor family from a host of other problems that were probably going on in that young man's life.
Right.
Same thing happens with, unfortunately, some of the mass shootings that have occurred over the last couple of decades, that we want to understand why. And for many folks, they find that, this shooter, whoever it happened to be, played video games and happened to like first-person shooters, ergo the games are what caused that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to be really careful about that linkage. And being in the industry, we every few years it would come up again, this is the problem that we're having. And just like any form of media or entertainment, that it's meant to be used sparingly, right? Like any good tool, any good piece of entertainment, it's got to be used, with a little bit of balance. And if you've got parents that aren't paying attention to that, it can turn into something kind of difficult, right? That they're ignoring everything else. But, every once in a while, somebody will try and make that claim. And yet there is a huge amount of research, like actual real research, that proves that that's not a direct linkage. Does it contribute? Yeah, I think there's something there, maybe. But it's definitely not what people want as a simple answer to why it happened.
No, good point. To bring it back to the book, at this point in the novel, Wade is kind of echoing his comments. He says that tabletop role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons were kind of the blueprint for Oasis. And there's a great passage at the very tail end of chapter 6. It reads, "As I learned more about how these early role playing games worked, I realized that a D&D module was the primitive equivalent of a quest in the Oasis, and Dungeons and Dragons characters were just like avatars. In a way, these old role-playing games had been the first virtual reality simulations created long before computers were powerful enough to do the job. In those days, if you wanted to escape to another world, you had to create it yourself, using your brain, using some paper, pencils, dice, and a few rule books. This realization kind of blew my mind." And that stood out to me as I was reading the novel the first time, as I read the novel, the 8th time, the 20th time. But it really was. This was our Oasis, right? We were able to create whatever we wanted to. We were given the tools in these rule systems by these great and creative people like Gary Gygax and Steve Jackson. And from there, we were allowed to just build these worlds as we saw it, and have these great experiences with these friends. And a lot of it did feel real. And that's why it was so addictive. That's why we wanted to play and stay up to 3, 4 in the morning, go to bed for, 2, 3 hours, get right back up again and do it all over again, because it was a way to escape all of the reality. It was a fun way to get away from all of that stuff and really just kind of lose ourselves in these wonderful worlds that our good dungeon masters, or even some of our bad dungeon masters, had created for us. So
no, I totally agree. And I think one of the interesting things is I've taught classes to video game developers in the past. I usually have them start out with a 2600 game. I'll show a video of bowling, right? And bowling is literally, the bowling ball is a square pixel. And I say, take away all the fancy graphics, take away, all the things that sort of give you this beautiful world. And it comes down to the gameplay and imagination. And if you can build something that works in that kind of environment, then great, move on and add all the beautiful graphics on top of that. But, these types of games, these RPGs, there's a reason that they've been so popular still to this day. In fact, Albert, if you go to a comic book store just north of us called Dragon's Lair, I don't know if you've ever been up there, but fantastic, where literally 2/3 of that shop now is role-playing games, right? With Warhammer and with, Shadowrun. And I mean, just it goes on and on, because it's tapping into something that's very primal, and that is somebody's imagination. You can imagine a world that's better than anything that a graphics artist is going to be able to render on a screen.
And it's from here that Wade finds a digital copy of the module for Tomb of Horrors, and he develops his theory that somewhere in the Oasis, Halliday has recreated the Tomb of Horrors, and that the first key is hidden somewhere inside of it. What he was stuck on was the very last line of the limerick that says, "But you have much to learn if you hope to earn a place among the high scorers." He considers a planet in Sector 2, but mentions that, Gunters had already combed all of the D&D theme worlds many times over, and so he really didn't think that it would be hidden there. And he kills himself over that very last line for a little bit, but he remains patient, and he kind of continues on with his research until one day it finally happens, and right while he's sitting and daydreaming in Latin class. And that kind of brings Chapter 6 to an end. Any questions? No, I'm kidding. But that is the end of Chapter 6. I can't believe that we got
to I don't believe you're done. This is impossible.
No, that's the show. We probably won't do another one after this. No, I'm kidding. We will. But yeah, that's how Chapter 6 ends. It's a really cool cliffhanger, right? I remember getting to this point, and yeah, I wasn't stopping. I wanted to know what exactly happened in Latin class that finally he was able to kind of crack the nut on this one. So
another genius move by Klein. I mean, I love it. Yeah. I mean, just the 4 lines in and of themselves, and yeah, it's a beautiful way of sort of piecing it all together.
All right. Well, before we go, can you please tell? Well, first off, thank you very much, buddy. Thank you so much for being here, for saying yes. I've had intentions of getting you on the show long before you even expressed any interest.
How about the video game episode? What were you doing?
Oh, yeah. Well, there was, I made some bad decisions. No, I'm kidding. There's plenty more video games to come, so we'll have to get you back on here. But thank you again for making the time to be on the show and kind of bringing your perspective to it all.
No, my pleasure. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the show, so this is a treat for me. So not a problem.
Yeah, thank you. And before we go, can you please be so kind as to let our supporters know where they can find you and your shows?
Oh, sure. So on Instagram, it's Mr. Snack Hack, literally all one word, no spaces, as is usual on Instagram. On Twitter, it's Neal Sega, and you'll usually find me as Neal Sega on just about every platform, whether that's, Twitter or any other of the social medias. But those are probably, the two that I spend a little bit of time on. And if anybody wants to, chat, interact about gaming and what I've seen over 30 years in the game industry, happy to do that.
Cool. Thank you. And I'm going to, we're going to stay connected for other things that have nothing to do with this show or anything else. But I do want to make sure that you give me some updates on how that 20th reunion goes for the Dreamcast.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah,
no doubt.
That'd be fun. And we'll have to report back on that at some point here. So for us here at The Basement, if you'd like to follow us on Instagram, you can do so at The Basement RPO. That's The Basement RPO. Twitter, at The Basement RPO. Facebook / The Basement RPO. We have a Patreon page if you'd like to support the show by donating money to kind of help keep the lights on. We've got a TeePublic site. Both of those links will be in the show notes. So please support the show in that manner, or just write us a review. You guys have been pretty kind and generous with the reviews so far. So thank you all for everyone that's done that. All right. Well, that's going to do it for Chapter 6. I can't believe I just said that. We'll be back with Chapter 7 and talk, obviously, more Ready Player One. We'll get into Tomb of Horrors a little bit more. We've got some Schoolhouse Rock to break down, Quidditch, and, of course, we will finally be talking about Doctor Who and the infamous TARDIS. So, until then, we'll see you guys next show. The views and opinions of the Basement hosts are of our own and are not in any way affiliated with Random House or Ernest Klein. All quotes, music, sounds, trademarked, and copyrighted material referenced in the show are owned by the respectful companies and creators and are used by the Basement as fair use for entertainment purposes only. It would take me a month to read this whole disclaimer, but sad to say, I don't have that kind of time.